So today we're excited about having Richard Gorremans, and he is going to be talking to us about the ghost towns of Washington County. And he was in the Air Force, and he grew up on the West Coast, and then he worked for the Department of Corrections and in California on the gangs unit. And so and then he also worked in Folsom. I would not want to try and do that, for sure. But anyway, and so he came here, and he is working on the ghost towns of the different counties here in Oklahoma. So he has Washington County, and he's just finished that, and he has the book, which is really good. And so he's going to talk to us about those. Thank you very much. Okay. Richard.
Thank you very much. Well, the last several months, everybody here has gotten to know me very well because I've been a pest. I'm a researcher by heart, thanks to my 6th grade teacher and who taught me history, and because she did it in a storytelling manner. And so she made it kind of interesting. When I came out here, I found that Oklahoma had a lot of history behind it, and I ran across a book one time in an old bookstore, and it got me interested, and I went down to some of the places in there and found out that they really didn't do a lot of research. They just contacted some people and wrote a few words and sold a book. And I do it a little bit differently. I've now got one of the most comprehensive groupings on the ghost towns. I've identified close to 300 of them now. And last year I found out that if I want to talk about it and write about it, I'm going to have to do it now. And because if I try to wait until I get all of the towns done, it'll be 10 years before I would start on a book. So somebody suggested just do it in smaller groups. So I broke it down by county. Some of them will have multiple counties depending on how many towns are in it. So I figure between 30 to 40 books altogether over the next few years that I'll be writing. Each one of them will be a smaller book, similar to what you'll be seeing today. And I do it in a storytelling manner, but I use the facts. And that's the fun part, is trying to figure out all the facts, because you have to find a happy line. And as Debbie found out when I go through a lot of this stuff, I'm a pattern matcher. And so what I do is I try to find where all the dots are and how to connect them. And first thing I found out about history is you can have 6 people in the same place at the same time looking at the exact same thing, and a week later every one of them will tell a different story. So my car is real easy to spot. This is actually on the side of my car. And this one is actually Oglesby, and the WP school that's out there. This is one of the last pictures that was taken of the church at Picture, the most toxic town in America. Oh. And then this is the next county that I'm actually going to that is part of the Sacred Heart Mission. And 3 buildings survived a fire in 1910 out there. And so I've actually been doing a lot of writing on that, and that's my next county along with Osage. And those are my next 2 books. Now the book itself, the current map I always have on the back, and then the front of the book will be some of the pictures from the county that I'm writing about. And I'll let you know up front, I will be spending a lot of time looking at my screen because I suffer from a TBI, so I have short-term memory loss. So these take me months to put together because I forget what I've written on each one of the slides as I go to the next one. So each one of them kind of triggers it for me. The biggest problem I've had working through everything is the term ghost towns. First thing people think about is boo, ghosts, and everything else. And so I'm always being asked about that. And ghost towns is actually the term that is assigned to towns that either don't exist anymore or abandoned. They were once flourishing towns, like Ringo was a very populous little community. It actually had a racing track out there at one time. And but the only thing that's left out there now is a 2-story building that used to be one of the hotels there. And so the story on that one is actually kind of interesting when you get into the book out of it. Many of the towns that I've run across, they still exist, but not nearly as big as what they used to. Like Tulsa was actually on a map at one time for being a ghost town. And that was just somebody trying to rip everybody off and selling a map. But Tulsa has a lot of small communities. Aslan, which used to be called Welcome, Dawson, and other small communities that were absorbed into the Tulsa County and the Tulsa itself. Bartlesville was very much the same way, Silver Lake, and was a very strong community, but now it's a lot of different subdivisions, so it's all been absorbed in. And let's see, 20th century, someone, yes, okay, so we're good with that. And part of the problem when you start talking about history is, where do you start? And 11,000 years ago, they had population here in the Indian Territory. Do I start there? 1824, oldest non-Indian city, Fort Gibson. 1866, the 5 civilized Indian tribes met in Washington to form Oklahoma Territory. How many know what Oklahoma actually means? Red man. Okay. Guess where they met? It wasn't Washington, D.C. Where was the capital in 1866?
Virginia?
New York.
Oh, New York.
Okay. The 5 tribes were so enthralled with the way New York looked, they actually named a town, I believe it's in Tennessee, Nyaka, and their version of New York. Now, Oklahoma has a town called Nyaka. It's over near Slick, and that's one of the towns I've actually written about at one time. 1889, the land rush. 1890, Oklahoma Territory, officially created in Congress. So most of what I'm going to be writing about is going to be after these times here, because I'll do some basic background with them. And this is one of the pictures that's most popular when you take a look at the land rush in 1889. It's one of the biggest races. Started at Fort Marino. They estimated about 50,000 people. When you put that many people stretched out, that is a big line.
Yeah.
Yeah, you won't see that at a Taylor Swift. Now, some of the interesting facts about that land rush. The race was open to single women and African Americans. People started lining up over a month in advance. So if you think those little tents on the outside of Targets and stuff like that on Christmas, nah. These people hold my beer. Settlers, they could claim up to 160 acres of public land, receiving the title 5 years if they lived on an improved property. And there's a little caveat on that talks about it in the book, because the allotments for the Indians was actually handled much differently. So there were no citizenship requirements, so anybody from any country could come in to join the land rush. Through that, you just had the Trail of Tears, and because the actual Trail of Tears goes in many different directions depending on which tribe it was. Between 1830 and 1850, the United States orchestrated what many have called an ethnic cleansing. And they forcibly moved approximately 60,000 of the civilized tribe members thousands of miles across what is known as the Trail of Tears. This is exposure, disease, starving, took many of their lives, more died after they actually arrived. When you look at some of them, there's a memorial at the Dakota Historic Site in Georgia, and the lives lost on that one. Cherokee, 4,000. The Seminole, 3,000. Chickasaw, 3,500. Choctaw, 2,500 to 6,000. They're not quite sure on that. Ponca, apparently nobody wanted to pick on them. They only lost 200. And the Creeks, about 3,500. Now, forming the Oklahoma and all the territories out through here required surveyors. And they went by the 96th Indian Meridian, or the Meridian, and because that is actually the separation line between the Osage and Creek Nation, and it is the boundary between Osage and Creek Nations. And then so you can see down through there on it, the 96 Meridian, right through there. And it was actually very controversial on that because the first surveyor that came through that the Osage used actually had it off as to where it was actually existing, and they had to come back in and do another survey. Now that meridian is used in all of the surveying except for the panhandle. That was handled a little bit differently, and I haven't found enough information as to what they actually did in the panhandle. First post office was opened in 1859 near Butler Creek and the Caney River. So the site was located just southeast of what is now known as Oak Park Addition in Bartlesville. So that's where the first post office was in the Indian Territory. And this is after the Civil War. The post office was closed in 1866. So it was actually closed before statehood. Now the book contents, this is one of the maps. Debbie can find it for you in the back. Most people haven't seen it. And so you actually have to kind of research this a little bit to find it. But it had a lot of the older towns that were in here, and that was much more accurate than a lot of the other ones that I was finding. I talk about Oglesby, Ringo, Silver Lake, Hillside Mission, the Hillside Witch. I do have some hauntings. Enosville, and there's a whole bunch of smaller settlements that are listed in the back of the book that I just couldn't find enough information on to create anything more than maybe a small paragraph. And I also give you the ghost town locations of all the places that I located in Washington County, plus all the references. Now when you come in, one of the first things you always read about is Oglesby. Let's see. There we go. The late 1800s, the cattle drives came through this area, and a lot of them went through the Oglesby area, and because it was kind of a crossroads. And many of them traveled through that area. And this is Frank, and I'm very bad at names. Gogler. He moved his family into the area in the 1900s, and says renting property from the Tyner family. That says they built a bridge and opened up a sawmill. And the bridge is there. And then their sawmill that they opened up. He sold the bridge to the county in 1907. And then so most of them that were incorporated into it that helped bring the county together sold a lot of their property throughout the years. And sometimes it's hard to keep track of them, how the land was actually transferred. And in Oglesby, there's actually the store that still exists there. And that has a little bit of a history because most people don't realize this was not the original store. So the store is a place with many stories. This is originally owned by John Jordan and operated by Clara, and this is the wife of Dr. Stevens. After moving to Ramona, the store became the Rodiker home. Tom Oglesby built another store, and that's where the post office was actually set up. And so that's the one that you see now. And because the Rodiker building actually doesn't exist anymore because it burned down. And Mr. Savage, he was the first postmaster for that area. Oglesby also was one of the first places where a lot of the controversy and exciting stuff started happening, murder at Oglesby. And it was written about in a lot of the newspapers. One of the sources that I use is newspapers.com because it has most of the newspapers. For some reason it doesn't have the Bartlesville Examiner. So, but luckily they do here. So July 30th, 1908, Charles Hobbs, he went to the Rodiker store to purchase items. This is Stallsworth, the mail delivery man for the post office at that time. He was also in there. He approached Hobbs and asked him if his name was Hobbs. After answering yes, Stallworth shot him, killing him instantly. So unprovoked, he never actually gave a reason for it. And he went through the whole trial and everything. The trial was covered in the newspaper. And on the day that he was sentenced, his son was actually standing next to him. The judge gave him an opportunity to say something, and he never said a word. But he did admit that he was the one who did the killing. Oglesby is also an interesting place because the storms didn't like it.
Yeah.
They talk about the tornado that came through that did a lot of damage, but a lot of the reports didn't cover what happened earlier that morning because it was a high windstorm that actually started some of the problems in Oglesby. Oops. It was all on a Wednesday. The town was devastated by two different storms, a high windstorm from one direction and a tornado coming in from another direction.
Wow.
Now they all converged. Now, apparently these storms did not like this lady, Mrs. Collins. It was like she was the center of attention. The first one that came through, it devastated a lot of her house. When the tornado came through shortly, it destroyed her place and actually caught it on fire and it burned down. There were 5 homes that were damaged, and hers was almost completely obliterated during that storm. 66 students were attending school that day. And this was some of the fun part that was put together, was how some of the timelines were. It says 4 of them were slightly injured, and but all the rest of them were totally fine. They did have, this school, when it was originally built, had no doors inside. After the tornado, there was a door in there. Nobody knows where it came from.
Okay.
So the newspaper in the Bartlesville Examiner did mention everything that was on there, but one of the things that it mentioned also in the bottom was that just a few days before the storm had come through and the tornado, the WPA funding for the school had been approved. And so the WPA was the work program that was put together by the government to help. They built almost over 130 schools in just the Oklahoma area, but they built a lot of other buildings also. And they're a very easy spot because of their style that they used. It was on every one of the buildings. The building itself, you can see the addition that was put in here on the main part. This is the front of it as you see now. But you can see the styling that's on the front of the building. I think the place is actually, it's either up for sale or has just been sold. And because it's been a community center for several years now. And usually when I go out to these schools, you'll see that it's a WPA, it's got it up on the top, but there's usually a marker on the front, either on this, the steps or something like that. And I couldn't find it. Because that's the one that tells me this is a WPA school. I did finally find it. Apparently during one of the storms they had or something like that, they had done some work on the front of the stairs, but they took out the bottom stair and actually took it out to the corner of the street, and it was over a drainage ditch. So when if you go out there, when you go right to the corner, you'll see the store right across the street from it. Just go to the corner where the school is and look down in the ditch right there, and you'll see the WPA marker. One of the other towns, Owen. Does anybody recognize the name of Owen? He was the first senator for Oklahoma. And Owen, it was just a railroad junction. It was not actually a town. Said he was born of money, and he received an excellent early education through what his father was able to put together and stuff like that. A lot of you will know Narcissa Owen. But his father died after the Panic of 1873 because a lot of the railroad companies were totally devastated during that time, so he lost all of his money. And Narcissa, she was a very staunch lady and also felt that her husband's debt was her debt. So after he passed away, she took on his debt. And she took her dowry, her homestead, and everything to pay off the debtors. And she was in poor health at the time, so she actually boarded at a friend's house, and during her stay there, she tutored the lady's daughters and a couple others. and because Narcissa was also a teacher. Now, the people were so happy with the work that she was doing as a tutor, they had actually come up with 4 scholarships, and they asked Narcissa if she knew of anybody that could benefit from them. And she immediately suggested her son, one of her sons, she actually had 2 of them, and Robert got the starting in his college from one of those scholarships. His brother actually went to the Virginia and the medical department at the University of Virginia, and he got his education that way and became very well known through that. This is Narcissa. Now that she'd taken care of what her kids were going to be doing and stuff like that, she came back to the Indian Territory, but she talked Robert into coming with her because he was not on the rolls yet. And they knew at that time a lot of the allotments were being set up, and so she wanted to make sure he was on the rolls. This is one of the earlier pictures of him. First thing, one of the things he did out here was he got into the battle about the balance that was due to the Indians from the 1835 treaty. And he got a huge settlement on it, of which he made $160,000 himself. And at that time, that is a lot of money. Said he was elected as one of the first 2 senators for Oklahoma, and he co-sponsored the Allotment Restriction Removal Act. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Okay. When the allotments were put together for the Indian allotments, this is what the removal restriction looks like. The idiots in Washington, D.C. made a decision that Indians didn't know how to manage their own property. So they assigned a guardian to all of the allotments with the provision that they could not do anything for 25 years. They couldn't sell it, they couldn't do anything with it, so they, without permission from that guardian. So Owen helped co-sponsor the removal of that restriction, which gave the Indians the ability to do what they wanted to with their allotment properties now. Okay, Monticello. Thank you. My TBI was kicking in for a second. And Narcissa spent a lot of time at the ranch, and but she spent more time at her place in Washington, D.C., which was only two blocks away from the White House. But she was very enthralled and interested in Jefferson, and she loved it. In fact, 2 of his grandchildren were born in this house, which isn't that well recorded. And so, but she named the house Monticello. And she was very involved with a lot of the stuff that was going on in Oklahoma at that time. She was involved in several of the community programs and the groups here in the local area, and they're all geared towards helping the community as much as possible. She passed away on July 12th, 1911. She was visiting a friend of hers, I think it was a relative actually, and she actually fell and was injured from that, and she never recovered. Now, Robert, he continued his political career. He rarely ever actually went out to the ranch, and so he was not involved with it that much. It says he passed away from prostate surgery complications on July 19th, 1947. Now, one of the interesting things about it is he actually wrote a book that I believe is one of the first variations of the Secretary's shorthand. And so he actually published a book on it, and in the book you'll see some of it, and actually, the book you can still get at different places, but I actually left one of the, got a picture of the writings that he put together, the chart. And this is where I came into problems because I couldn't figure out what he did with the property. Now we know that is a floodplain now, and a lot of people think that the ranch is actually underwater. It's a wildlife reserve, and I did manage, thanks to the Army Corps of Engineers that is still out there at the lake, and they looked back through their records, and where the area was that the Owen Ranch that showed that they paid $516,000, 833.75 cents for the property, but they paid it to somebody that was in another state. So sometime after Owen passed away, he actually sold the property, but we couldn't find any records as to when he actually sold it. And, but the area is a wildlife reserve now. When you go out there, you have to actually go up into Caney and come back down, and about a mile before you'll actually see the entrance to where the old Highway 75 was. And that Highway 75 would come down through, would actually cross over the railroad tracks down here, which are still in operation, and it continues up through, because you actually see some of the new work that they're doing. But the ranch was actually right out in here. So it is part of the floodplain, but it's never actually been underwater per se. And so probably during a flood at some time, part of it was underwater, but it's now leased out as cattle ranchers. So when you go down through there, you'll see a lot of it. And I actually walked down through the old Highway 75. It's about 1.5 miles through all of the old stuff down through there before I got to the railroad tracks. And then I put my drone up, which you'll actually see some of the stuff I work with over here. And because I do a little bit of everything with it. And but I talked to them. So the ranch building itself, after 1975, when the Army Corps of Engineers started doing their work, all of the houses were removed out. So what actually the final disposition of the Monticello was, nobody actually knows. It was just destroyed during that time. Now, to our hauntings. Hillside Mission, I'm going to leave. You have to go to the book to find out all the history on it. But the Hillside Witch, I'll give you just a little bit of information on it. Everybody, when they're growing up, has always had the little campfire stories that you get into. Somebody's telling a story to get everybody scared. Now, the Hillside story is about the love of one lady for her husband. This is Jenny Thornton. And I did manage to find her name, and I found all the information, which you'll find in the book. It said she met and married her true love, Abel Parkhill. And this is Jack's tomb out there, for lack of a better word. Her first husband, she was actually married in Muskogee, and she divorced him and married Jack, and they moved to the Hillside Mission area. And you'll actually see it a little bit here. See if I can get it going correctly. This one was a little bit choppy, so if it gets too choppy, I have fun with my drone when I go through. But this is the largest cemetery in the area. There's over 1,100 people that are buried in that one. And his tomb is actually right in down through here. Now his wife is also buried in the same cemetery, and you'll have to go out there and actually take a look at the plot mapping for the cemetery and find the final pieces of the story. Because the final piece of the story is actually kind of interesting. Good. Now the story about everything that was with it was she was so taken by him that when he passed away, she wanted to bring him back to life. And the people, noticing that he was not attending any of the events anymore, went out there. They found her in a chair next to the bed, and he was dead, and she was trying to, was chanting the same thing over and over. And that chant is actually written on the side of his tombstone now. And but every time that they took him away and buried him, she would go and dig him back up. And they went back. So finally, after several times of going through this, they actually encased him in concrete. And so the next day after they buried him in the concrete, this inscription appeared on the side. And it was supposedly, she cursed the town for burying her husband that she couldn't bring back to life. So, But to find out the rest of the story, you'll have to pick up the book to find out how that one actually.
So where is this? Is this in?
This is the Hillside Cemetery.
Where's that?
Yeah, it's right on the border of Tulsa County and Washington
Okay.
County. And because the cemetery itself is is in Tulsa County, but the mission area, when it was originally done, was actually in the Washington County area. But the stories were so interesting and so intertwined with Washington County. And because the mission church that was out there has actually been moved like 3 times. And its final move was to become a barn, and which Debbie Neese has actually visited at one time or another. Enosville, this was a very interesting little town. Since for years, the argument in town was about where they actually lived. Kansas or Indian Territory. This was one of the problems where they had problems with the surveys and stuff like that. Now there was several articles that I found as I went through it. This is, even to this day, they still argue about the name of the town. Was it Enos? Enos? Enosville? Or Enosville? For the book, I went with Enosville because that's the one that I could find the most information on. Now, one of the reasons I like this particular area is this is where the Daltons came through on a very regular basis when they were raiding and robbing. And because most people didn't realize they had a place that they kind of hung out at. I called them the good, the bad, and the Daltons.
Yeah.
So they migrated to the Indian Territory in 1882. Very large family. There was 13 kids altogether on that one, and so they had a lot of them. Some of them were law enforcement, some of them weren't. These were the ones that were mainly involved in the criminal activities, and but they helped out with the guerrilla bands during the Civil War time period. And this lady here is the one that everybody completely misses, but they know her as Julia Dalton. Her original name was Julia Johnson. She traveled from Fort Smith with her family. There was a wagon wheel that was damaged on it, so they actually ended up getting separated from the wagon train. Frank and Emmett Dalton, they were coming out from their fort about the same time. They came up on them just as some Indians were starting to attack their wagon. Emmett, he was very smitten, as they put it, with Julia, and so for years after their original meeting, they would kind of run across each other off and on. And when the Dalton gang was going, they actually spent a lot of time at her place because that's where they hid out. So that's where Enosville comes in, because that's the closest town I could find to where they say that she lived with her family. Now they eventually got married, but there was a whole long story behind all of that. And everybody knows about the famous up in Kansas, the Dalton they wanted to be more famous than Jesse James, so they decided as their last name, they wanted to do something that he couldn't, so they wanted to rob 2 banks at the same time. So after 2 years, the gangs went out with the same bad decisions, because their first robbery that they did was a total screw up, and they didn't get much of anything, but somebody actually died on that one. And so this one was just the same. They didn't go in like they were supposed to. They didn't check a lot of things. A lot of things had changed, and they assumed a lot of things. And we know how that goes. Okay, so what I've covered today is just a little bit of what's in the book, and because I could spend 8-10 hours talking about the book and still not cover everything that's in it. But the stories are fun when you take a look at them, because I've used as much of the factual history as I can. So in the book, you'll find out about Silver Lake, the Hillside Mission. We'll discover the details of the Dalton gang, because I went into a lot of detail out of that one. And the book and the movie was actually written by Emmett and Julia Dalton. You'll hear about the fires and the shootings that happened throughout Oklahoma that made it very special. And I'm going to go back just a little bit on the Julia Emmett Dalton, you'll find her gravestone out at the same place that the Bartles are in, which
Dewey Cemetery.
Dewey Cemetery. Okay, thank you. And it's kind of interesting because her first husband, that was killed by one of the gentlemen here in
Fred Keeler.
a gun battle, she made a huge headstone and actually had another headstone with it saying who it was that killed her.
Yeah, that was Fred
And
Keeler.
hers was one of the little small plaques. But where it's positioned is very interesting, because when you go out there, and it's in lot number 2, the same lot as the Bartles are. So when you go in there, you'll see the Bartles up on one side here. Go down to the next street and start going down that street in the cemetery. You'll find one little headstone out in front of everybody else. She's about 6 inches from the road.
Yeah.
And she never said why she chose that particular spot, and I think my own personal advent, and that was the only time I gave a personal opinion, is that she just wanted to put her thumbs up to everybody about being who she was. And so she didn't have a lot of money at that time, but she is in front of everybody now. You can discover the names of the smaller settlements, many of the names, but almost no history about them. So there is a listing in the back of the book that you'll find. And I have a lot of the documents that I've run across that I've added to the book that makes it interesting. So you'll be able to get to see the actual writings of the people that wrote some of their stories for the museum here. So I'm going to go out through the book. The back of the book, you'll actually see through here, the QR code on here will actually take you to the website that I'm been putting together. And so I have the only Google map that has the almost 300 towns that you can actually go into my Facebook group. And I got about coming up on 20,000 members in there now. But you can actually see where all the towns are and actually plan trips and paths to go down through there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a fully interactive
Cool.
map on it.
Wow.
And when you look at them, you'll see some of them, they're different colors, and I've still got to update them with what I've done with Washington County. But I changed the color as to whether or not I have researched them and whether or not I'm done with it. So the ones that are showing up in red are the ones that I have visited and have a lot of information on.